This video is all about the new Blur module in Darkroom version 3.8. We'll go through the different types of blurs, be it lens blur or motion blur or Gaussian blur, and we'll give some ideas of how to use it, what pitfalls to avoid, and its strengths. I'm Nicholas, and let's go. This new blur model is actually quite intuitive to use. The interface is clear. We have here a picture of diaphragm blades. So here we have 5 and just a few options we can go through. The radius of the blur is the amount of blur you want to add to the picture. So 44 pixel radius. And if I go to 92, the image gets blurrier. The computer slows down just a little bit. So that is the blur radius, very intuitive. Blur types, so there are 3 types of blur. We can do a realistic, physically realistic lens blur, motion blur, or Gaussian blur. So the Gaussian blur is the one you'd find in Photoshop. What is usually used to blur a surface, which is appealing, if you like, aesthetically, but not physically correct. So blur type, the lens, the diaphragm blades. So I have here a lens with 5 diaphragm blades. If your lens has 9, then and you want to stay as close as you can to reality, then move that up to 9. Concavity is a strange one because it is actually physically not correct. It's maybe for creative use, but if you bring the concavity up, if you get some really weird things going on. Strange patterns of blur, and they all do make blur. If I put the blurs up here, you get some very interesting shapes around the details, so not physically correct maybe. I don't really know why it's there, to be honest. Why not? So there we are. We have diaphragm blades concavity and linearity would be able to simulate the rounded aperture blades you have. So if you have a lens with 6 rounded diaphragm blades, then you could bring linearity down and it would maybe simulate something close to what the aperture would look like inside the lens. And you can rotate. The last slider is rotation. So quite a simple interface. There's not much to change really. Just one thing to notice is that for a given radius, the more diaphragm blades there are, the smoother the blur. I can show you that if you like. So if I take a snapshot there with 5 diaphragm blades and move up to 10, then the image has got just a little bit blurrier. I don't know if you can see very well. Maybe on the eyes here, on the beak of the bird, as I go back and forth, you can see it's a little bit more or less blurry. So that is something to maybe, if you're not interested in being absolutely realistic, but you want to finally adjust the blur, then maybe you can change the diaphragm blades and maybe also the linearity, I suppose. The less linearity you have, so perfect round circle if you have 0, then the smoother the blur will become. So how would you actually use this module? Well, I have several ideas. The main one for the lens blur would be to, let's reset this, to get some background blur on a photo that didn't have very much, because maybe the background was very close, and maybe because the lens you have isn't a very expensive one. I mean, who can afford a 500 millimeters f2.8? Does that exist? I don't know. I have an APS-C camera. I don't have a full frame. The lens I took this with was 100 to 400, and the background wasn't very far away. So that is the best blur I can get. It is actually at 6400 ISO, so there is a little bit of noise. So imagine I want to eliminate a little bit of the background. Well, what would I do? I'd think, well, let's make a drawn mask around the bird, and I'd have to go around the log as well, and the feet of the bird there. So I'll do this quickly. I'll just go around the body of the bird, and let's see if I can blur out the background. Okay, that's not a very good mask, but I'm sure we can get something decent quite quickly if I get a feathering radius. I might make that mask a little bit smaller. I want to keep the detail in the feathers around the side here, especially here on the right hand side, while let's get the opacity up. And I've got quite a decent mask here. I'm not saying it's perfect. It is actually. We could check on this right hand side here because that's where it is the best. Let's not waste time making the mask better. I have a good mask there and I want to blur, but if I do that, you'll notice I'm blurring the inside of the bird. So I need to invert the mask just to blur the outside. Now, the problem when you invert a mask is that all the area of transition is now inside the bird. So I need to make that mask bigger. Now I could have started with this. And I want to come right down to the edge here and get a decent, so it wasn't bad around the right hand side, so it should be quite easy to do now. There we are. So not so good round here. We have quite a good mask on this right hand side, so let's concentrate on that. So I have now a blur which is quite a good blur around the back, and let's have a look. It's actually quite obvious what's happening. I have here a halo effect. Let's zoom in here, see what's happening. I have a halo effect, but and there's not much I can do about this in the current state of the module. Now, why is that? Because if you look at the mask, get the mask back on, it is actually not affecting the inside of the bird at all. It is affecting just the outside, but the problem is it's taking the colors from the bird into the background. So it's actually blurring as if there wasn't a mask and then masking on top. And if you want to do some close detail background blur like this, I remember doing this way back with Photoshop, where you'd have to do a decent mask of the bird, cut it out, remove it from the photo, so you'd have some transparency behind, blur, and then stick the bird back on top of the blurred layer to have all the details. And so really what would have to happen is that the blur would have to not take into account what is masked out, and that we don't have the option for the moment. Now you can try input after blur, output after blur. Some things it might change a little bit. You see, the effect is not quite the same. The truth of the matter is that we don't have the option for the moment. Now a little bird, he told me that the developer does know about this and may, I hope, let's cross our fingers, propose an update to the module which would allow that. So I'd be looking forward to that. So how can we actually use the module as it is? Well, it is a very useful module. There's nothing wrong with it. Well, let's go back. We just have to be a little bit more selective for the moment in what we're blurring out. There's no point in blurring out all the black areas here. What I'd like to blur out maybe are the two leaves at the back, which are a little bit too present. Maybe even what it was a tree trunk, I think, behind here. Let's blur that out by selecting with a path. So I could actually just select the part I want to blur. I don't want to go anywhere near the bird, so I don't have any halo, any edge effects. Now, do I have room to go outside here? Oh, yes, maybe. Okay. So I have a mask here, and if I just blur this, then I should actually be fine. Put a bit of feathering radius just to make sure that I don't get any strange, weird artifacts between the blurred area and the unblurred area. A little bit of blurring on the mask, just to make sure, get rid of that. And we have something that is actually quite realistic, at least in my view. Let's see before and after. So that was before, and that is after. So the background is a little bit less present. Just be warned though, the image I have is quite noisy, and blur will remove the noise, so you might have some strange transitions where you see kind of smooth areas here, and you have some very noisy areas a little bit lower. So that might be something you need to work on. Now, to be fair, the documentation does say that this blurs module is not made to replicate kind of an out of focus depth of field thing, because it doesn't take into account the amount of blur locally to blur more or less. It is the same blur all over the image. There is a workaround though for the noise thing, would be to add some grain instead of removing carefully all the grain on the non-blurred parts. You can add some grain on the inside. Now there are two modules recommended for that. There are two. There's one called grain and one called sensorize. Now grain would be easier to use in my methodology. I'll show you that. I'll just type in grain. Look, if I put grain on, and that adds, we'll leave the coarseness there. Now, why am I recommending grain? I'm actually going to eat my hat on this one and say that I would recommend to use a raster mask from Blurs. Now, raster masks are pixel masks that come from a mask that you made previously in another module. Now, to be able to use a raster mask, the previous module has to be before in the pipeline. So grain comes naturally after Filmic, so after Blurs. So we can use a raster mask from Blurs on grain. Whereas if you use Sensorize, it doesn't mean you can't. If you use Sensorize, then let's just add that by default. Then Sensorize comes before Blurs. So if you want to use Sensorize, you'd have to press on Control Shift and move it after Blurs if you want to use a raster mask. So I will move that one back down again because I don't want to use that one for today, and I want to use grain and on a raster mask. And then I think what we need to do is zoom in and try and see there's more noise here on the leaf than on the background, so I'm sure we can reduce the strength or the coarseness just a little bit, kind of match them up. I'm sure that's possible. Put a bit more there. Now, why am I eating my hat on this one? It is because I've always been saying that I don't like raster masks because I can't control them. I can't see them. If I want to see on grain here, the button is grayed out here to look at the mask. You need to know it's the same one as on Blurs. So we know that the mask for grain is the same as Blurs, and so I can see it here. Now, what I didn't realize, and I have to apologize for that, is that if you update your mask, I'm going to do something silly just so you can see what I'm doing. So there was the mask, and let's say I want to add another shape. Let's say I want to add, now very quickly, another place that I want to blur. And you think, well, I've blurred that, so I need to add some grain. Well, what is done is it actually updates, and this is something I did not realize, is that the raster mask is recalculated and reapplied automatically to grain. And I don't know if you saw, if you can see the grain appearing there, but it does appear. I don't know if I make it coarse, you can see there that it is appearing here as well. It automatically updates. So if you're using two modules in conjunction with each other, then okay, raster masks, good tool, perfect, very good idea. And there, that's said. So you have a choice. Either you add grain or you try and denoise the rest of the image, but there is a little bit of work to be done. Now, what got me really excited about this blur module is, well, not particularly the lens blur, although I can see the usefulness of it, but rather the second option here, which is the motion blur. Now, motion blur has some different options. So blur radius is the same as before, and the direction will be blurring in a straight line, horizontal. 90 degrees would be vertical. You can blur in any direction you like. We'll see about curvature and offset after. Let's just do direction. So on an image like this, which is a slow shutter, I'm actually quite pleased with the lady there. There's a lady and two dogs. The background, if it's a little bit distracting, I will be able to get rid of that with this motion blur thing. So let's make a quick drawn mask. I'm going to go wide around this main subject. Now, why is that? Well, because of the halo effect that we talked about before. So let's go around there, invert the shape, make sure that I'm not touching anything around the shape there. Now, it wouldn't really matter so much if there's a bit of kind of a transition between the colors of the subject and the background. It's a very blurry image to start with. Okay, so let's say I have a mask of the background there. Let's get rid of this. And the thing is, you see, you can see an angle. Now, I can't measure the angle. It would be lovely to have an option where you'd right click, and you get the angle set. Now, that would be good. But what you can do is, if you add a blur radius, and if I just change the angle slightly, just to match the image, here the lines there, give that a good blur, and I bet you can't see anything, which means it's looking natural. But if I look at before and after, you can see that some of the vertical lines that were here got some dodgy shapes here. They have absolutely disappeared, and it looks fine. You can actually blur it a lot more to make it as smooth as you like. That's working before and after, and it cleans up a lot of the shapes here if you're looking closely, and that cleans up the shapes nicely. The last example on this blur module is this picture of a sunset taken over the sea. The camera was actually on the railings of the boat to have kind of a slow shutter speed. I think it was about a third of a second, because I wanted the sea to be slightly blurry while still capturing the sunset and the coast here. I wanted it to be kind of not too out of focus. But the sea here is not blurry enough for me, so I'd like to use motion blur and try and get this blurry. So the idea would be to have kind of a horizontal blur and kind of blur just the sea out. Now, what I have done is I actually made a gradient. There we are. Did that before. They do that in cookery shows. This is what I did before. So I have a gradient now. So I have before and after. It's not using the gradient at all, is it? So we have before, sorry, and after. That's just blurring the sea. I don't find it particularly realistic. Now, what I could do, I think, just for starters, I don't think the gradient is kind of, I think it needs to move the transition, I mean, a little bit better. But it's not the transition that's bothering me. It's the actual shape of the waves, because it's as if I was zooming past really fast if you do a horizontal move. And this is where we're going to use the curvature. We have two sliders here, curvature and offset. Now, the curvature, we'll actually, instead of doing a rectilinear blur, we'll do a curved blur. Kind of the blurs will be in curves. And that will mimic the movement of the sea actually quite well. And that is better than before. I can show you before and after. So make a snapshot with a rectilinear blur. Actually make it a little bit bigger, just for the example. So 65 radius. Take a snapshot. There we are. And now if I do a curved blur here, and the offset if you click on the offset, you can actually turn the blur around. So it starts vertically and then it goes horizontally. Now, too much is too much. And I think it actually looks quite good like that. Let's see what it's like before. You see on the left, you have the rectilinear horizontal blur. And there on the right, you have kind of this curved blur. And I think that works actually really well. I find it quite natural, quite pleasing to the eye. So that is a brilliant idea for an option. So yeah, thanks very much to the developers for that. And that is really the blur module. Not much more to say. Easy module to use. Oh yes, you're going to say to me, there's the Gaussian blur. What's a Gaussian blur? Okay, well, let's not ruin that picture on a Gaussian blur. So what's a Gaussian blur? Well, let's go to this picture here, which you may have seen before. I use this to explain the blend modes, especially the multiply blend mode. So let's go to blurs and go to Gaussian blur, lens blur, motion blur, Gaussian blur. So a Gaussian blur is the one you find in other photo editing software. So it's just kind of a uniform, smooth kind of blur thing. Now, what would you use that for? Well, maybe for smoothing skin, smoothing surfaces, but I'm not sure for skin it's the best solution. The documentation says it can be used for creative uses using blend modes. So I thought, well, why not? Let's have a look what we can do with blend modes. So the first one I went to, but I went to actually difference, subtract and difference. And this kind of gives you the lines of an image. Subtract there maybe is better. And I thought, oh, that's a Laplacian, isn't it? Or something close to a Laplacian. And that's the obsession of trying to preparing the video on diffuse and sharpen, and that uses Laplacians. But okay, that's maybe pretty. I don't know. I thought it might be used to find dust spots, but it doesn't seem to work that well. And then I hit on the multiply blend mode, and I thought, well, this brings out the sun rays just as the multiply blend mode did for other modules. So okay, and I'll just show you this one. If I do, I already prepared, if you like, just to save time, a nice mask on the sun rays. And if you move the blend fulcrum up a little bit to avoid the darkening, then we get a little bit here more, I don't know if it's called it local contrast, maybe, probably. But you do have the color problem, the saturation problem, which we also had before. So that is one, we'll call that one creative use of the Gaussian blur. It actually does exactly the same thing for a lens blur, so I'm not sure it's a creative use for the specific Gaussian blur. Creative use of blurs anyway. I'm sure you have many more ideas to use the Gaussian blur. So I'll let you play with that. We'll stop the video here, and I'll hope you have a nice day and see you next time.